Welcome to Economics.com 0.2. I am so excited you're here. Today, we're jumping straight into a dynamic, whiteboard-style animated explainer, covering the very heart of how our world operates. We're going to break down the dual perspectives of economics, microeconomics and macroeconomics. So let's just dive right in. If you've been thinking economics is just, a bunch of boring numbers scrolling on a stock ticker somewhere, get ready to have that idea totally flipped. We're going to look at the real-life applications, the facts, the figures, and those massive underlying systems that literally govern our daily lives. All right, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the scope of economics. Then we'll look at the lake ecosystem. Third, zooming in, microeconomics. Fourth, zooming out, macroeconomics. Number 5, measuring health. And finally, number 6, policy tools. Okay, section 1, the scope of economics. Before we split this whole subject in half, we really need to establish just how incredibly vast this playing field is. What's kind of fascinating is how economics constantly redefines its own boundaries. It's not just about money, it is fundamentally concerned with the well-being of all people. That means folks who are currently employed, and, just as importantly, those who are unemployed and actively searching for work. High incomes, low incomes, the whole spectrum. It even gets into how producing useful stuff can create, massive secondary problems. Like, think about environmental pollution for a second. A factory might pump out super affordable cars, right? But if it pollutes the local water supply doing it, economics studies that exact trade-off. We also look at how investing in education boosts worker skills and human capital, which directly pumps up a society's total economic output. We're probing the heavy, complicated stuff here. Like, how do we actually know when a massive corporation or a labor union is working to benefit society as a whole versus when they're just using their monopoly power to help their own owners or members? And of course, we got to look at how government spending, taxes, and all those sweeping regulations totally shift the daily production and consumption choices of literally millions of people. It touches everything. Moving right along to section 2, the lake ecosystem. So because this subject covers so much ground, we really have to divide it into 2 parts. To understand why we need 2 completely different perspectives here, I want you to imagine a biological ecosystem. Just picture a vibrant, complex lake in your mind. If you were going to study this lake, you could approach it in 2 totally different ways. On the left side, we've got the micro view. Here, you're a researcher focused purely on specific individual elements. You're looking at the cellular structure of one specific type of algae, or maybe the mating habits of just one particular snail, or the growth rate of a specific tree on the shoreline. But then look over at the right side, the macro view. Here, a different researcher takes a huge step back to look at the entire lake from top to bottom. They don't care about the one snail. They're asking the big questions. What eats what? How does the whole food chain stay balanced? What happens when massive environmental stresses hit, like a sudden freeze or some invasive species jumping in? Both of these researchers are studying the exact same lake, but their viewpoints are completely different. And honestly, both are absolutely crucial. Which brings us perfectly to our core thesis for today. Take a look at this quote. The micro and the macro insights should blend with each other. Seriously, whether you're scrutinizing lakes or national economies, you absolutely need both lenses. Studying the specific plants, that micro perspective, that helps you understand the very foundation of the food chain. Meanwhile, looking at the macro food chain explains the overall, harsh environment that those individual plants are actually living and competing in every day. They aren't competing for your attention. They're totally complementary pieces of the same puzzle. All right, section 3, zooming in, microeconomics. So now that we had that lake analogy in our heads, let's bring it back to the real world by zooming in on our individual economic actors, microeconomics. This is the study of the actions of individual agents within the economy. We are talking about specific households, individual workers, single businesses. This is literally the exact economic equivalent of studying that one snail or that single patch of algae in our lake. We really want to understand the nuts and bolts of how these distinct, independent units operate day in and day out. So, what kind of questions does a microeconomist actually ask? Well, what determines how you and I spend our household budgets? Right? Given the limited amount of cash we bring home every month, what specific combination of goods and services actually fits our individual needs and wants? Just think about your own life for a second. How do you decide if you're going to work full-time, drop down to part-time, or maybe grind out some overtime hours? How do you figure out exactly how much of your paycheck to stash away for retirement? Or if you should borrow money right now to buy that car you've been eyeing? All of this is wrapped up in what we call the theory of consumer behavior. It's analyzing the very real, everyday trade-offs we all make. And the analytical questions just keep coming when we flip over to the theory of the firm. What determines exactly what products a single business will decide to produce and actually bring to the market? How do they calculate the exact perfect price to charge so they maximize their revenue, but without totally driving away their customers? And what dictates how many specific workers they're going to hire this quarter just to meet demand? How do they finance the whole operation? When do they make that incredibly tough call to, say, build a massive new factory, downsize their staff, or maybe even close their doors for good? These are intense, microscopic decisions, but they completely dictate the underlying daily reality of our entire broader economy. Next up, Section 4, Zooming Out Macroeconomics. Okay, time to take a giant step back from those individual households and single businesses. We're zooming out from the specific algae to the vastness of the entire ecosystem. Macroeconomics looks at the economy as a whole. Instead of agonizing over your family's budget or a single local bakery's pricing strategy, macro focuses on massive, broad, aggregate issues. We're talking about the total growth of national production, which you usually hear referred to as gross domestic product, or GDP. We're looking at the total number of unemployed people across the entire country, the inflationary increase in the general price level of all goods combined, massive government deficits, and huge flows of international trade. It is the ultimate top-down view. And the scale of these macro questions is honestly staggering. What actually determines the overall level of economic activity in a whole society? Basically, what dictates the total volume of stuff, goods and services, a nation can physically produce in a single year? And crucially, what determines how many total jobs are available across the entire national economy? Notice we aren't asking why one specific tech startup is hiring right now. We're asking why the entire labor market is expanding or shrinking all at the exact same time. Going even further, what determines a nation's overall standard of living? When you dive into the historical facts and figures, you see these massive divergences where some nations experience this explosive increase in wealth, while others just completely stagnate. What causes the giant machinery of the whole economy to suddenly rev up into a booming expansion? Or worse, grind to a halt in a painful recession? What systemic forces cause companies everywhere across totally different industries to start hiring more workers simultaneously or, unfortunately, initiate mass layoffs? Ultimately, what underlying factors allow an entire economy to sustain real, long-term growth over decades and decades? So how do these two perspectives interact? Well, it builds this perfect feedback loop. Just like our lake, the micro and the macro are completely inseparable. The overall macro health of the environment directly influences micro decisions. Take a single firm, for example, a micro agent. They are way more likely to hire new workers and build new facilities if the overall macro economy is booming. The broader environment dictates their specific action. But flip it around. The macroeconomy's performance isn't just magic. It actually depends on millions of those tiny individual microeconomic decisions made by everyday households and businesses. The whole economy only grows because those individual agents decided to go out and spend and invest. They constantly drive each other. It's a continuous loop. All right, Section 5, Measuring Health. If we're dealing with this massive macroeconomic system, how do we actually know if it's doing well? What are the true vital signs of an economy? Imagine three massive pillars holding up a healthy, functioning society. We can accurately gauge an economy's macroeconomic health by checking these three main goals. Pillar 1, growth in the standard of living. Pretty straightforward. This just means the economy is producing more over time, increasing the overall wealth and resources for everybody. Pillar 2, low unemployment. This means the vast majority of people who actively want a job can actually go out and find one quickly, which keeps the whole economy running near its full capacity. And Pillar 3, low inflation. This means that prices for your everyday goods and services aren't just skyrocketing out of control. It protects the actual purchasing power of the cash in your wallet. If a nation can maintain steady growth, keep its people employed, and keep prices relatively stable, well, that nation has a fundamentally healthy economic lake. And finally, Section 6, Policy Tools. So, knowing the goals is great and all, but how do we actually achieve them? Governments basically use two main sets of tools to manage the macroeconomy. Over in column 1, we have monetary policy. This is exclusively handled by a nation's central bank. So in the US, that's the Federal Reserve. Monetary policy involves strategies that directly affect bank lending, interest rates, and financial capital markets. Let's look at a real-life example. If the central bank wants to speed the economy up, they might lower interest rates. That makes it cheaper for you to get a mortgage for a new house or for a small business to get a loan to expand.
So next time you hear the news talking about interest rates going up or down, you're literally hearing about monetary policy in action. Now, jump over to column 2, fiscal policy. This is determined by a nation's legislative body. In the US, that means Congress and the executive branch. Fiscal policy involves direct government spending, taxes, and creating the federal budget. If Congress passes a huge infrastructure bill to build new highways, or if they cut income taxes so you keep more of your paycheck, that is fiscal policy. Central bank equals monetary, legislature equals fiscal. These are your two primary toolkits for managing the whole shebang.
I want to wrap up this explainer with an incredibly provocative thought from the source material. We've gone through the micro details, the macro big picture, and those powerful policy tools the government has at its disposal. Now, Americans tend to deeply expect that the government can just use these tools to quickly fix whatever economic problem pops up, right? Whether it's a spike in inflation or a sudden, scary recession. But given the sheer, overwhelming complexity of this vast, interconnected ecosystem we've been talking about, to what extent is that expectation actually realistic? Can pulling a few fiscal and monetary levers really perfectly control millions of independent microagents? It's a huge, profound question, and it's one you should definitely keep top of mind as you continue your journey into economics. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll catch you next time.